Yeah, thank you guys for joining, Michael. I agree. Like when you listen to one of May's tapes and she lists out 100 people who are all interconnected, and you don't know who half of them are. You just, but she makes the connection so nicely and neatly. It is amazing, and it's a little bit of an overwhelm. But tonight we're going to try to tell a story that's really complex and add some background to it. And we won't get through the whole story, but we'll do what we can here. And it is just an incredible and amazing story. Can you all see my see the mural board now? All right, let's see. Hang on, I'm gonna try that one more time. Okay, great. Now I can see the top of it here. All right. So just kicking it off, May did at least 4 hours on her tapes back in December of 1978. And last time we met, or the time before when we met, we threw out a few subjects: JFK, RFK, MLK, or Jonestown. And people like wanted to jump on Jonestown. So we did that. And last week we did just a basic timeline of the Wikipedia version. So we told the story that you were supposed to hear from the mainstream media, from the Wikipedia version of the timeline. And today we're going to peel the onion back to May's version, which, as you can imagine, might be a little bit different and maybe a little more interesting. So we're going to go way back before Jonestown and talk about the Kristallnacht or Crystal Night. And this was the name the Nazis gave to the evening of November 9th, 1938, where they tried to, this is the 15th anniversary of Hitler's first attempt to overthrow the German government. And they just rained havoc on Germany, especially the Jewish stores and merchants. And it was just the night of chaos. And to connect some of the dots back there, because one thing she'd always talked about was the Nazi connections to the government and the events that were happening in the United States, especially California. It took me a long time to get a grip on that. So every time she's able to connect some dots, it helps for me. And here, this is from a book talking about the purchase of Frank Turpel, who was a CIA assassin from Otto von Bolschwing's subsidiary. So Otto von Bolschwing was a German commando in one of Hitler's commandos in Nazi Germany, and they were connected via business dealings in the United States. And they had a mutual affiliation that went beyond the CIA. And one of the things that the CIA kept saying was that, hey, we're not operating domestically, like we don't do anything inside of the United States. But people kind of understood that maybe they had some front companies and that there was some things going on. And Leo Ryan was investigating that later on in our story. He comes in. He's a congressman from San Francisco. And that was these operations in the United States were a direct violation of the CIA charter. But later, Turpel admitted on the BBC that during this time, he was supplying mercenaries and arms to the early stages of Jonestown in Guyana, when the Jumbo Camp was used as a CIA training center. And that link to von Bolschwing provides a little bit of a glimpse into the Nazi CIA Jonestown connection. And it is a bridge between the Kristallnacht and the White Night. So Jim Jones's idea of a White Night or a Kristallnacht was to bring everybody together and to have a suicide party, like suicide drills. And some of them lasted for days and days. And he would call on the loudspeaker. Everybody would come in from Jonestown into the main area, and he would just rant and go on these drug-fueled rants, and they would do suicide drills. And that went live on November 18th in 1978. 900 followers of his died in the murder-suicide ritual in Guyana. And Guyana, prior to Jim being down there, when we were talking about Frank Turple and von Bolschwing doing CIA operations out of Jonestown or Guyana, that was a British colony. So Guyana was still a British colony. So there's British intelligence connections to what was going on there. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. But all of this ended up going up in flames on November 18th, 1978, and was sparked by a visit by Congressman Leo Ryan, which is a kind of a interesting, complicated subject, and why he was down there in the first place, because he was a congressman from San Francisco, and people in his district, he was a school teacher, then a school principal. He was kind of a self-promotion guy, and he got himself elected to Congress, and he was investigating some of the domestic terrorism activities that were going on in California. And his constituents who were trapped in Jonestown, some of them asked him to go down and check on his people or to get them out. And he was very concerned. Probably not the best idea to go down there, since he got whacked on the runway when he was down there. But there's a couple stories around getting him to go down there and why he went down there. But at the end, 913 people were dead. Most, they say, from drinking cyanide-laced concoction, but there's evidence that people were shot, that they were force-fed the cocktail. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So Jim Jones, he was born in 1931, and he met his death on November 18th, 1978. And he was quite a character. So at one time, he funded temple activities by selling monkeys door to door. Here's a few pictures of him selling monkeys door to door, if you can imagine, trying to raise money selling monkeys door to door. And well, monkeys will come into our picture again in a few minutes. So just to give you a little bit more of a touch on Jim, he was a child growing up in Richmond, and he was like a child evangelist on the street corners. And he came in contact with a character named Dan Mitrione. And Dan was in the police force, and he was eventually the chief of police, I believe. And then he got recruited into the CIA. And Jim Jones's comments about him, when asked, was, there was one guy that I knew growing up in Richmond, a cruel person, even as a kid, a vicious racist, Dan Mitrione. And Dan, his job, he ended up working in Brazil in the early 60s when Jim Jones was there with his family, coincidentally. And his job was training right-wing government security services on how to torture people. And they would pull people off the street for practice. They were trying to find the best way to get information out of people. And Dan was then subsequently kidnapped in Paraguay on an operation by the very group that he was persecuting. And they tried to trade him for 150 of their compatriots with the government, and the government said no thank you, and they said, okay, here's Dan's head. And then subsequently the group was wiped out by the right-wing security services. And here's a few pictures of his torture methods. So going back to the early Jim Jones, he was a student pastor by 1952, so age of 21, and he had established a community church in 1954 in Indianapolis. And he began selling monkeys door to door. In 1956, he established his church that would become the People's Temple. And the name stemmed from the fact that he got the site was an old Jewish synagogue that he purchased. Somehow he came up with the money for. I don't think it was from selling monkeys. And the guy who owned the temple was Rabbi Maurice Davis. And I need to research him a little bit more, but he made his reputation as a prominent anti-cult activist and sometime deprogrammer. And I think the pattern followed later when Jim moved to San Francisco, that he got a Jewish temple as his preaching place, his temple. Yeah. So a lot of this comes from this book, was Jonestown's A CIA Medical Experiment, a Review of the Evidence, which came out in 1988. And just a fantastic book, 680 pages. And I'm going to try to condense a lot of that information here for you all tonight. And you can see it's not cheap. And I couldn't even find his second book, Michael Myers. That was on the connection between AIDS as a biovirus. And he says that he interviewed William Colby, the former head of the CIA. And then the next day, William Colby turned up dead. So he recognized that he had a hot potato and he kind of needed to back off of public interviews. So he went into seclusion and wrote that second book for 17 years. So I'm itching to get my hands on that because this thing is just dynamite. So one thing about Jim was he was kind of like the model socialist, portraying himself as a model socialist. And that's one tact that the right wing does sometimes is, they just kind of false flag themselves, or they sheep tip themselves as the opposition. And he did social and racial integration at the People's Temple in Indianapolis. And he actually got a post with the government of like the human rights leader for Indianapolis for some period of time. And he had a largely Black and elderly following, and he did a lot of good work at the time. But his troubles began to chase him out of Indianapolis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But he also had a lot of issues with his sexual appetite. He thought that every other man on the earth was a homosexual, and he had like basically a harem at the church, and he would separate married people. He would say who you could marry, who you couldn't marry, who you're supposed to have children with. So it was a cult, and that became obvious over time. And one of the quotes in the book, what good fortune for governments that people do not think. So we're trying to do some thinking here. All right. Before we go to this, I'll just go to the big board and talk a little bit about the timeline, since maybe you all didn't see the recording, but starting in before 1955, he was in Richmond. And then they moved the family to Indianapolis, where he started his ministry or his cult, however you want to look at it. And oh, by the way, in between, he did some work in Cuba. Well, what's that all about? And then he went to Hawaii. Well, what the heck? What's going on in Hawaii? And then Guyana. Previously, in the early 60s, we already saw that Jonestown was a CIA base back at that time, which Frank Turple admitted. And then he goes to Brazil, and he's hanging out with Dan Mitrione and some other folks down there. He's got a job that, like Oswald at the Riley Coffee Company, he gets paid, but he doesn't have to show up for the job. And he goes back to Indianapolis after leaving Brazil, and then he's out to California. He's off to California for 10, 15 years. And when things got too hot in California, he vamoosed out to Guyana. He took his whole crew down there to Guyana. So just to lay some timeline against what he was up to, where he was, put some context around it. You guys have any questions or comments so far? Kind of making sense? All right. Hey, Amos.
Keep going, buddy.
All right.
Yeah, I'm good.
You're on the right track. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to do a little bit of deep diving. So try to stay with me. It's a lot of information to take in. It's kind of like a May Brussels broadcast. It goes by fast, and there's too many things to catch on to. But this is from a New York Times article in December of 1978. So right actually when May was broadcasting her shows. And we're talking about this family, the Layton family. And at one time, 6 members of the Layton family were involved with the Jonestown cult. And the New York Times is saying, hey, this is a great story about why and how hundreds of other families became entangled in this pervasive web of religion mixed with social activism. So this is the cover up story. They're a family that seemed to have everything: intelligence, plenty of money, education, proud family tradition of Quaker nonviolence, much like Ruth Paine and Michael Paine, Quaker nonviolent people. And Lisa Phillips was the daughter of Hugo and Anita Phillips, who both came to the United States prior to the World War II. And they went back and forth to Europe. And she was born in 1915. They had been engaged in the banking for at least 200 years. And her childhood playmates included cousins and friends of the German Jewish aristocracy, the Berensons, the Rothschilds, and an uncle, Dr. James Frank, won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1925. And he later worked on the Manhattan Project, and he factors into our story quite a bit. So just remember that that's Lisa's uncle, Lisa Phillips. And it turns out that Hugo and Anita were agents running Nazis out of Germany after the war, using the Vatican rat lines to get Nazis distributed across the globe. So they were tied into the network. Now, Dr. Lawrence Layton, well, first, Dr. Frank, he was at Pennsylvania State College, and his student, a graduate student, Lawrence Layton, he was one of 3 out of 40 graduate students who passed the physics test to become a graduate student. And he was just a sharp guy. And it turns out later that they were both on the Manhattan Project. Remember, this is Lisa's uncle, Dr. Frank. And it was Adolf Hitler who first conceived the atomic bomb, and his scientists worked on that. And Dr. Frank was one of the scientists that worked on it. It wasn't a coincidence that they were ready to explode their bomb days after Germany surrendered. They didn't want to use the bomb on the fatherland. They wanted to use it on the Japanese subhumans. So they kind of kept it off the books. So they were in control. That's the kind of influence that the Nazis had on U.S. policy at that point in time. And they actually had a huge influence on the Cold War as well, as evidenced by sucking in the whole Gehlen operation, which is the East German, or the Nazi intelligence agency East. So Gehlen handled everything east of Germany, including Poland and Romania and Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. So he had agents in all of those places, and that plays into a lot of things that happen in the United States. And when we get into Oswald, we can talk about like how was he able to have his cake and eat it too over there in the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, working at the Minsk radio factory. There's something strange about that. So this guy became a professor, Lawrence Layton, and he was also became the chief of chemical warfare at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah in the fall of 1951. So this guy is a smart guy. He's tied in, and he's getting commissions. This is the portrait of the Layton family. So there's and I didn't go into really the marriage to Lisa, because it was Lisa Phillips who married Larry Layton Sr. at Pennsylvania State College, kind of in an arranged marriage. Remember, Lisa was the niece of Dr. Frank. So she was well positioned to jump in on this affair. And as a further tie-in, Professor Layton's son, Larry Jr., was the only person tried for the killing of Congressman Leo Ryan at the runway in Guyana. So these guys were tied in like nobody's business. And I can't do it justice, the ways that these people were tied into Jonestown and the ways that they facilitated, funded, and directed it. So many of the experience at Dugway under Layton's direction had to do with nerve gas. And the problem was that, hey, this nerve gas works, but the wind blows and it blows it willy-nilly. You never know where this stuff goes. So they worked on that problem by letting it go at the Presidio and tracking it across San Francisco, and then trying it in the New York subway. So that's how they try to solve some of those problems and understand the wind blow of the nerve gas. And Dr. Layton's process was he used laboratory monkeys, but that wasn't working very well. So he then substituted human test subjects, and that would be his last contribution, because ironically, his next project would be top secret, an unpublished experiment utilizing human test subjects in place of lab animals, an experiment in ethnic weaponry known as Jonestown. Just like, let that sink in for a minute. Pretty scary stuff. So as kind of an afterthought, he went on to kind of be afraid of the atomic weapons in theory. He wrote this article in Esquire about what are safe areas for if you're going to have a nuclear war, where are places that are safe? And some people think that this was a code telling people where to go or what to do, people who were connected, because the safe areas were north and west of California, the city of Eureka, where right next to Ukiah, where Jim Jones had his California church, and another place was in Brazil at Belo Horizonte, which is another place where Jim ended up living and working with his family, and Dan Mitrione. Another place was Hawaii. So these things were all connected somehow. And after Jim got back from his work in Belo Horizonte, he up and picked up his congregation and moved them from Indianapolis to Ukiah, Northern California, north of San Francisco. And as a reminder, like, because he was on the Manhattan program, like, everybody in Dr. Layton's family had security clearances, even the kids, right? So the kids, Deborah and Larry Jr., they had multiple security clearances because they had to get cleared when he entered when the parents entered the country, and then they had to get cleared when he went into the Manhattan program. The grandparents were associated with the Nazis. Uncle worked on the atomic bomb. The father, senior, was working with the uncle on the Manhattan Project, the uncle-in-law, and he just so happened to be the head of chemical warfare. So just tie-in after tie-in after tie-in. All right. So just a little side note, this guy, Eric Traub, he was a chemical warfare specialist, biological chemical warfare scientist, worked secretly with Navy Medical Research Institute, CIA, Army, founded the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Plum Island program. And in the 30s, he worked for the Rockefeller Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, on viruses and bacteria. And he was an active member of the America Deutscher Volksbund, the American Nazi club, basically. And he was debriefed as part of Paperclip and about his work on biological warfare and research, his activities there during the war. Apparently, he did some work for the Soviets, and that laid the groundwork for the Fort Detrick offshore germ warfare animal disease lab on USDA's Plum Island. He was the founding father. And it just so happens that Dr. Lawrence Layton worked there from 1957 to 1978. And he also worked out at their Western Regional Science Laboratory right outside of Oakland. And it was really close to the other things that were going on out there with the Simonese Liberation Army and the People's Temple MKUltra project. And they continued that work on racial biological research that they were working on in Germany. And Jonestown was its secret cohort testing grounds. So those are pretty interesting assertions. And there's a lot of circumstantial and other evidence around that. So what this is also saying is that Deborah Layton, who was the daughter of the Lawrence Layton, one of the daughters, she was actually in charge of the finances for the temple. And Dr. Layton contributed greatly to the finances of the temple because seemingly it was his experiment. And when they went up to set up these dummy corporations around the world, dispersing the People's Temple finances, the signatories weren't Jim Jones or even their attorney, Tim Stone, but they were Deborah Layton and other high-level temple leadership. So that was kind of like Martin Bormann distributing all of the Nazi funds across the globe when he figured out that the Nazis were going to lose the war so that they could reconstitute somewhere else. And then there's a big story that we might get into about what did Deborah do in the last days of Jonestown, because she was down there with her mother. And she ended up with all the money after the fact that they couldn't find, that they couldn't come up with. So, this assertion is that the Jim Jones and the temple was a covert, government coordinated racial, medical, social control, and pacification experiment that extensively used sleep deprivation tactics as a means of brainwashing and mind control. So it fit right in there with MKUltra. And this guy is saying that the medical, military, industrial, congressional complex, they turned Oakland into that experimental ground. And you can kind of see that with how they funneled all the crack cocaine into Oakland as well. And what was going on there in Oakland also was that the Black Panther Party was taking off, and people were feeling their power, their associated, hey, we need to fight for our rights. We're being oppressed. And there were things going on in the prison. The Black Cultural Association was like a prisoner self-improvement program where they were teaching the Black men to take care of themselves and present themselves and learn. And so they would come out different than they went in. And that program was co-opted by the CIA, by Donald DeFreeze, who was a police informant and who later formed the Simonese Liberation Army, which was another op. And they ended up that they were connected with Jones. He used them for his purposes, and they ended up kidnapping Patty Hearst, and that kept Jonestown and all kinds of other things out of the news because Hearst owned the newspapers, and that was going to be the headline. So it was quite a distraction to have Patty Hearst being kidnapped. And in the big Jonestown book, there's something called the H file, which detailed at least 5 murders that Jones was involved in, kind of Arkansas style. And he was defended by the Temple Council. They cleaned everything up with donations, intimidation, and blackmail, kind of Epstein style as well. Like he had a list. And one thing that Jones would do is to his flock was he would have them sign a blank piece of paper. And then whenever he needed that, he would write a confession or a story that he could go and blackmail them on. So that was part of the, do you have faith deal to be in the cult? So those are some connections to Oakland, to the Nazi biological and chemical weapons crew. And what stood out for me was that, hey, we just lock, stock, and barrel lifted the Nazi program and put it into MKUltra, and that's what we're seeing, and it continues to play out today. So what they're saying is that somewhere between 63 and 65, they went to Dr. Layton and said, we got a problem because this country is exploding. Black citizens are demonstrating and rioting for their civil rights. How dare they? There's a strong possibility that the American Indians were going to rise up. There's a lot of racial unrest, and it wasn't under control. So they were hoping that Dr. Layton, the most distinguished chemical scientist, could provide some pharmaceutical solutions to the violence, even to such a degree that Ronald Reagan formed this task force against violence at the UCLA Neuropsychological Center. And it had a lot of tie-ins to experiments that they were running on these prisoners at Vacaville Prison and Folsom Prison to pacify them and turn them into kind of slaves. And that was part of what Jim Jones was doing, is turning people into slaves. And it wasn't the white people he was turning into slaves. It was the kids and people that were assigned to him from the government, like the welfare programs. And yeah. Josh, talk to me.
You were talking about, mind blown so far. When you started talking about, there's a couple things. So it's just interesting. We were talking about all the monkey stuff with Jim Jones, and I noticed we're at my in-laws, and it looks like monkeypox is like blowing up. And I just thought, how ironic.
Yeah.
Monkey business everywhere. So you were talking about the prison a moment ago, and I was thinking of the Stanford prison experiment. I wasn't sure isn't that like the same time this stuff was going on? I don't know. I don't know what year that was, but that was pretty interesting. And I just was immediately thinking of that. Like, I wonder how that tied in.
Yeah. And I've seen, and I think it was around the same time. And I think Stanley Milgram was tied in some way. I haven't done the background on him, but I do think that he was tied in.
Wow.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're saying here that they developed several ethnic behavior modification drugs in their MKUltra project, but none had been adequately tested outside the lab. So that Layton was assigned to take this thing live, basically on a large scale field test, see what they could get to work. So Jim had the perfect environment for doing that. And he couldn't be, Dr. Layton couldn't be involved because he was, after all, the chief of chemical warfare, and the government couldn't be accused of sponsoring it. And a lot of people didn't know about it. Very few people in the CIA were understanding of the experiment, had a high level of security, and Dr. Layton had to know. And as the agency usually deals not with individuals, but with entire families for security reasons, it was decided, instead of bringing others into the experiment, it'd be best to have Dr. Layton's wife and children administer the project with the help of a figurehead scapegoat named Jim Jones. So the lifetime actors come in, and the family members, and the keeping things in the family. And these guys had their hands in this thing from soup to nuts, from beginning to end. And some of them profited and some of them suffered. So this is Larry. So this is Larry earlier here. And then this is when he was being taken from Guyana. when he was arrested down there. And back in 1967, he was up for the draft, and Jim Jones helped him get a deferment. So he wrote to the draft board or President Carter or somebody. Actually, it wouldn't have been Carter at that time, but he wrote to the people who knew, and he had swing, so he could get him a draft deferment. So Larry, who is the Professor Layton's son, and his wife, they work for Jim and gave 25% of their income to the church. And that was standard, right? 25%, kind of like Scientology type deal. And they got all these elderly people to sign over their pensions or their Social Security checks or their life insurance to the temple. And Jim broke the family up by having sex as one of them. They don't know which one, and assigned him another wife, who Jim Jones later impregnated. So there was a bunch of sexual control going on there as well. But Larry Layton was the only one tried and acquitted of killing the defectors on the airstrip in Guyana. And then he was tried and convicted of the conspiracy to assassinate Leo Ryan, not of murder, just the conspiracy. He was on the plane, and they searched them for weapons, but he had planted a 38 inside the plane. So he went back on the plane, got the 38, shot two of the people who wanted to defect and go home. And then at the same time, a truck pulled up and sprayed the place with machine gun and killed 3 or 4 people. One of them was the congressman. And the first trial ended in a mistrial, and it was 8 years later that they had the second trial. And a lot of the attorneys were associated with Jonestown or the People's Temple who were on this district attorneys. And it was kind of like a Ghislaine type trial. Like he was a lone nut and no conspiracies were tried. It was no conspirators were tried, even though he was convicted of conspiracy. And, they just covered it up just like they do these days. There's nobody else from that whole, none of the muscle down there was convicted, even though there were, they let the bodies lay on the ground for a week before they went down there in order to have everything decay so they could get the real drugs out of their system. And they would have trouble identifying or processing. They only did like 7 or 9 autopsies on these people. And it kind of has its own story of the demise and the bodies. So Deborah Layton, and that's so Larry's sister, Deborah, had married Philip Blakey, and she was in charge of the temple finances with Tim Stone, who was one of the temple attorneys who later defected. And he has a hell of a story on his own. One of his sons was adopted by Jim Jones and was down there in Guyana, and they were trying to get him back. And Harvey Milk, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors guy, wrote a note to President Carter saying, hey, Jim Jones is a freaking rock star. And, this kid is best in the hands of the Jones family, and Tim Stone can go piss off. And there's all kinds of these San Francisco politicians just oozing for Jones because he contributed money to their campaigns. He fixed elections. He brought his tribe out and protested places who were competing with the candidates that he was supporting. So he was very, very connected to San Francisco office of the mayor and San Francisco politics. And that's one of the reasons that he was able to put himself out there as a humanitarian to have welfare children and elderly people assigned to his compound in Ukiah, which actually had a guard tower. It had armed guards. It was a cult camp basically in Ukiah in California. So Deborah, in the end, she ended up with millions in her name, which were not recovered after the massacre. So there's Larry, and then here's Deborah in the middle. They went to Jonestown in December of 1977. So about 11 months ahead of time. And she stayed there for 3 months. Remember, she's the finance person. And Jones sent her into Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, to interface with the government, the US officials, Russian officials, and the Cuban embassy. And they were trying to paint themselves as communists. So when the thing went up in flames, they could blame it on communism. And her task was more important than other members in Georgetown. They were there to bribe the local officials with liquor and sex. They were to do the Epstein deal. And as the destruction grew near, they wanted to get it associated with the communists. So that's where the blame would fall. And her work was to falsely establish that he was in league with the Russians to help hide the fact that he's really working for the CIA. Wow, does that sound familiar? And then in May, she feigned a defection from the temple and escaped to Washington, D.C. under the escort of Richard McCoy, the CIA station chief in Georgetown. And her timing is perfect because she was 6 months before the thing went up in flames, and that allowed her to complete like her part of the operation and to secure the finances in these offshore accounts. And like, here's a modern picture of her. It looks like it's from the 2000s or so. So she got away with murder, basically. So Jones kind of helped her cover by calling her a traitor and an agent, and that she stole money from the temple. So he kind of set her up as being in opposition. And they weren't really viewed in the proper context by outsiders like Congressman Ryan. They were left with that impression that Jones opposed her. And she went to California. She actually moved in with Grace Stone, related to Tim Stone, the attorney, and other temple aides who had defected at some time. And she had this big affidavit that she put up about there's a possibility that they're going to have a mass suicide. And so she was distancing herself and creating this story. She sent the copies to the Secretary of State and to Leo Ryan, who was a congressman for San Francisco. And the intention was to further entice Ryan into personally investigating Jonestown while providing Deborah with a perfect cover. And after the massacre, she would appear the innocent victim who had tried in vain to warn the government of the pending tragedy. So just going into that a little bit more, like why would she want to have Leo Ryan or Cyrus Vance involved in this thing? And well, it turns out that at the time, Leo Ryan was, here, let me mute you, Eric. Okay. Yeah. Leo Ryan was going toe to toe with the CIA. He was investigating what was going on at Jonestown. He was investigating other domestic things that he felt like were going on in Oakland, like the earlier stories that we told of the SLA, the People's Temple, other Zodiac killings, all you name it. And May covers all that stuff. But Ryan was getting suspicious that the CIA was operating domestically against their charter. So he, right after Watergate, he put in a bill that said that they would be overseen by a congressional committee and not by the military, and that passed because of Watergate. So, and as part of that oversight committee he was on, he was gigging them on their domestic operations. So he was a thorn in their side. So get him down there where he can be taken care of. Like, let's take care of business. Get him down to Jonestown. You're not going to assassinate him on the street in the United States, but it's easy down there. And I think he's still like the only sitting congressman that's been assassinated. So this guy, another guy, there's lots of guys. We're going to cover some of them, but we can't cover all of them. But George Phil Blakey. So Deborah, this one, met him in the UK where she had gone for college, and they had a marriage of convenience. and apparently they said in this book and other places they never consummated the marriage. But he was a special forces guy, this guy, Phil Blakey. And he used to pick up the people that had been recruited in Brazil to bring them to the CIA training camp at Jonestown. They had, I think, 3 ships or 3 like trawlers, and they would deliver weapons and people across the South America and the Caribbean. And that was one of his jobs, was to recruit people in Brazil and bring them up to the camp. And it's saying he managed it like a business. He had a couple hundred special forces advisors and Brazilian mercenaries who helped clear the jungle as part of their basic training. And there were a couple camps at Jonestown. There was a main camp of headquarters and a training camp. And they needed ultra sophisticated weapons and explosives. So they were training people to go to Angola and fight in that conflict in Angola as mercenaries. And it says that Deborah, the wife who was in charge of the People's Temple's finances, was funneling money into that project, and that there was only one CIA arms dealer with British connections who was involved in the special forces training of African mercenaries, and that was Frank Turple. So it ties right back into Frank Turple. So I thought that was interesting. And then after this goes into kind of how, Deborah set up the congressman, and which we talked about. And then a year later, she ditched Phil Blakey. It was an arranged marriage anyway. And it allowed him to stay in the United States and to operate. And then it also allowed her to be at Jonestown under the name of Blakey and not under the name of Layton. And in 1980, she married another People's Temple person. Talks about how these things were all very incestuous, but she got away with all the money, and she went into finance of some sort after. So she went right from like the jungle and this exercise or operation into finance because she had a lot of money at that point in time.
Hey, Tim.
Yeah.
Tim, I also was reading something about Blakey where his family had, their wealthy family from England that had ties to some chemical concern in Belgium that was mixed up with some elite child porn abuse ritual stuff. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, not surprising, given that these people, they look for families to compromise, and it goes down through the generations. You can see it now, right, with the generations in the United States. And maybe that chemical company was tied in with IG Farben. It's, the stuff goes like really deep. And that's why I think like pulling these threads, like who are these people? The Wikipedia is just the face, right, that they want you to see. And there's clues as to what these people did and who they really are. And that's what May kind of cracks down into, but she can only get to so much in an hour. And there's so much more to understand the connections. And so I'm going to look into these people later, Tim Stone, Mark Lane, and Charles Geary. But I wanted to go, if you all are still good, into some of the stuff that he was into when he was traveling. Because he had a few missions to go on, Jim Jones, that people should be aware of, right? And so like in February 1960, he suddenly decided to visit Havana. And they wrote a cover story in the New York Times in 1979 for it, but one thing is that he brought people back from there for his temple. And this guy, Foster, served as an alibi. And what was it that he was actually doing there in Cuba? He had spent 13 hours with this guy Foster, but they didn't speak the same language. So what is it that they were doing together? And really, it is a bit of a mystery, but it looks like a necessary spying mission. There's circumstantial evidence that the CIA was encouraging Cuban immigration, and he documented the destruction of an airplane piloted by mercenaries. He was out there with Castro at the site taking pictures. The Russians brought Sputnik to the Hilton to review, so there was Russian technology that they were spying on, and it would seem he was spying on Castro himself. And the CIA file on him coincides precisely with the dates of Dan Mitrione's tenure at the State Department. So after he was killed, they ditched that CIA file on Jones. So it's likely that he was his first handler, Dan Mitrione. And he's saying that they were down there in Cuba for his first international assignment. He was photographed with Castro. They went on a tour of the interior to inspect some wreckage of a U.S. plane. He was photographing it, and the charred remains of the pilots, and he returned to Havana to set up headquarters in a resort hotel. And according to his cover, he was a missionary who wanted to recruit 40 Cuban families to return to Indianapolis with him in exchange for money and support. And he befriended this guy Foster. After 13 hours of briefing, he agreed to leave his home and join the People's Temple. He moved to Indianapolis, but just prior to the scheduled invasion of Cuba with the Bay of Pigs, he disappeared. And so one thing that they posit that I made some sense to me was that Bay of Pigs might have been designed to fail, because they took all of Castro's adversaries and they turned them against Castro, but there were only 1,500 of these anti-Castro Cubans who went into Cuba against, call it 100,000 troops. So it was basically designed to wipe out Castro's known enemies. So I thought that was an interesting theory. So
I just want to throw something in here that's pretty contemporary. Is at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, there was 2 Russian special forces units that were sent in to secure the 2 airports there around Kiev. 2 crack units with the best troops that Russia has. That they were sent up against Ukrainian units that were 10 times their size.
Yeah.
Very
amazing.
similar situation.
Yeah, amazing.
And of course, they were eliminated.
Yes.
So like some of Putin's competition essentially were eliminated. Pretty much right off the bat at the beginning of the Ukrainian war.
Yeah. So it's really twisted the motivations for some of these things and hard to decompose. But I think considering both sides of it is helpful to the understanding, because it could have been that way, right? It could have been the like, why didn't the CIA kill Castro after all that time and after all that talking about it? Like, I mean, they killed just about anybody they want to. So what was it about Castro? Maybe they didn't want to kill him. After all, maybe they needed that foil on the southern coast, and also someplace where the Soviets would readily deploy their technology so they could be spied upon. I don't know. That's just one thing.
And this may or may not be related, but there's whispers, maybe shouts of Trudeau being his son. So I mean, Castro may have connections that aren't readily apparent here. Yes,
good point. Really good point. He does absolutely look like him, and apparently he acts like him too. So
it also reminds me a bit of that that operation to take out Osama bin Laden, where all those wasn't there like a
SEAL team.
A crack team that they took out the helicopter scene. I don't know. So, right? Something like that went down.
Yeah. So I think it was SEAL Team 6. And
yeah, there it is. Sorry. You got it.
They, they claim to have killed Osama bin Laden in some very unlikely circumstances and disposed of his body by dumping it out to sea, all of which seems very unlikely.
Yeah, a traditional burial for those guys, right? They're desert people, but it was a traditional burial at sea.
Yeah, I mean, it just stinks. And then, let's just wipe out all the witnesses in a convenient helicopter crash. I mean, it reminds me of the inconvenient Arkansas type accidents that keep happening. And then at some point, May goes into all of the assassinations after the fact of the Kennedy assassination. So witnesses were getting bumped off. And then especially it really ramped up when they had their hearings in 1978, which coincided directly with Jonestown, the hearings. And Mark Lane was the impetus for those assassination review hearings. And she goes into a lot of detail around his activity as a disinformation agent. But he actually left the hearings and went down to Jonestown to precede Leo Ryan and his crew so he could kind of get Jim preps for what was going to happen. And so he was really tightly tied into that. And the other thing that, just real quickly, that he did was he and Larry Flint posted a reward for any information on the Kennedy assassination. And they collected all the evidence and then they just deep sixed it. It never went anywhere. And not only that, they then knew who the people were, like the potential witnesses that could expose things. And those people started dropping off, that having unfortunate accidents. It's ugly.
I'm sorry, did you say that Lane and Flint collaborated together?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And she goes into that as well. So the other thing that Jim did was he took a trip to Hawaii a few weeks after he got back from Cuba, and ostensibly to scout for a new site for the People's Temple. But Hawaii was one of the points that was safe from nuclear war, like safe from radiation, which doesn't make any sense because that was basically the floating aircraft carrier over the Pacific. And we saw that didn't work out in World War II. So that didn't make any sense. We don't know what the heck he was doing out there. And there's some suggestion that there were, like Oswald, potentially multiple Jim Joneses, running around doing things so they could confuse people. And he kind of dropped out during that period. Well, in Hawaii, that's the same time when Barack Obama Sr. was visiting Stanley Ann Dunham out there and conceiving Barack Jr. at the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii, which was a CIA exchange program for global African continent or Asian continent politicians who they wanted to groom. And there's some also evidence that there was a lot of MKUltra work going on at the University of Hawaii during that time, and the possibility that Jim got some programming out there while he was there. And the doctor, which I need to go back and find out, this Sukadeo, I think he was a Guyanese doctor involved in the MKUltra, but he's saying that Jones had been treated at the Neuropsychiatric Institute in San Francisco during the 60s and 70s. And he tried to find his medical file, but they wouldn't release it to him. And even though Jones has been dead for 20 years, he couldn't get the file. And it says that this was a leading center for brain research. And remember that they were doing research at the UCLA Neuropsychological Center to figure out how to prevent people from being violent, right? So pre-crime and then pacification. And this is a leading brain research center. It's noted to be an anti-cult activist, work there. It's also known for its experiments performed by DARPA. Okay, so I don't know how those two things overlap, anti-cult and DARPA. There's a lot of classified research, but they were doing things with EMF, behavior modification, and one of them was including hypnosis from a distance. And that triggered a thought in my mind that one thing that May said was that Jack Rupe had a hypnotist at the club prior to killing Lee Harvey Oswald. And it's kind of thinking like, what could possibly get Jack Ruby to go in and do that thing where he knew that he was going to be the next target? Had to be quite a threat, but the idea that maybe he was hypnotized to go do some of that work, that resonates a little bit, like it makes some sense. So he gets back from Hawaii, and then he very quickly goes down to Brazil, and he arrived there April 11th, 1962. And he's saying that maybe there was a double. They couldn't figure out why he was visiting Cuba or why he was permitted to enter Brazil in April, considering the fact that he had just been to this communist country of Cuba. He was given a visa for 11 months. He traveled to Belo Horizonte, and Dan Mitrione had settled as an ops advisor at the U.S. consulate there. People who worked there said that he didn't do shit. He left every day with a briefcase and came back every night. They didn't know where he went, but he got a check from Eureka, which was a company, and that what everybody knew, and kind of gave him an alibi for the time where he wasn't around. He also said that he was like a traveling financial salesman. And there's not a whole lot of information down there, but apparently he was fascinated by the magical rites of Macumba and Umbanda, and to have studied practices of the Brazilian faith healers. Now that makes a lot of sense. Like he was down there to understand some of the mind control, the religious or ritual mind control things that were going on. And I don't know who David Miranda is. I'll have to search him up. But he's said to have done a bunch of work on ESP, and those were, of course, MKUltra issues. And he was trained in that mass conversion techniques of the Pentecostal faith. And he was quite an expert at that point in time. So he was just adding to his repertoire. And he met this guy, John Lodison, who was a CIA agent. Lodison worked in Hawaii. This principal, new Russian, just the man to handle the passport problems of Jim Jones, the American psychopath. He actually applied to visit the Soviet Union and made repeated trips to Cuba's Castro. So they were establishing that connection to communism before they blew this thing up. Just some pictures of Jim and some of the flyers. Come see Jim. He's a prophet. He's a public school teacher and a government official. He's a healer of cancerous diseases and doctor called incurable. Pastor of the largest youth interracial religious movement. Come and hear Jim's divine message. And
so the degree, though, this has got the medical side as far as faith healers and stuff like that. He's kind of creating the false version of alternative healing and as well. Certainly creating that element. And I think certainly this is serving some of the different masters that are out there as far as like the pharmaceutical industry and the chemical weapon industry.
Yeah, it ties it in together, right? He's leading people down down a garden path to destruction, like leading them away from the truth. And it does tie in. It ties in IG Farben and the pharmaceutical industries and the big pharma and the mind control pieces. And I thought this picture was just fascinating, right? So this related to his faith healing, Michael. So this says that, and they said the one thing that he did was, as part of his faith healing service, he would cure cancer. So he was curing this gullible patient of throat cancer, and he would actually like push a rancid chicken liver down the patient's throat, which they would vomit up. And, one of the members would do that. She would choke it up and he would say, hey, it's a miracle. The cancer is gone. Right. And everybody would go right into it. So it's very much like we played last week. We played Fletch Lives, where the Reverend Farnsworth heals people and Chevy Chase heals people. And he would send people out to do research on his flock, and then he would call them by name and call their affliction, and he did the whole thing. I mean, it's ugly. And this is where Tim Stone is written a note in 1972 to say that he is asking Jim Jones to sire a child by his wife. And what the hell is going on here, folks? He wanted to raise a child, but was unable after extensive attempts to sire one himself. Jim Jones, he wants to do this by the most compassionate, honest, and courageous human being in the world contains, Jim Jones. So the child was born January 25th, 1972. He's privileged beyond words. Thank God Jim Jones was his natural father. And the thing is that this is the son that Jim actually took down to Guyana with him, that Stone was supposed to be trying to get back. One of the people that he was trying to get back. And there were some other people too as well.
But this was the lawyer that was in charge of the church's finances, though, right?
He was, and he was like a fixer. Like he would get them out of trouble when they murdered somebody and did things. But he broke off at the end, like within a year of the end, he broke off to separate himself. Most likely because he knew what was coming.
This is kind of certainly embarrassing in what I would be embarrassing if.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
People he knew that this is done.
Yeah. I mean, it's So here's where Guyana is, next to Venezuela, Brazil, and Georgetown, I think, was the capital, which is right on the coast, was 150 miles away, actually. So it was very, very remote and isolated. Once you got down there was no getting out, no getting back. And this shows in 1974, they started sending equipment down there. And it was crated up in Redwood, trucked to Miami, and loaded on a ship bound for Guyana. Note the Army surplus truck. The U.S. government provided most of the heavy equipment for the project because, after all, it was a government project, as a couple people have stated. And here's some pictures of Jim with politicians of the day. So with Rosalind Carter, campaigning for Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale. And here they are, coming out of dinner, San Francisco hotel, private dinner with Jim Jones, Rosalind Carter. And then here's Jerry Brown and Jim. Jerry was a big fan. Then here's the seagoing trawler that they had at Port Katuma. And then, this piece was a period piece. I believe in Jim Jones, and it immediately got me to, believe the science, like trust the science. Kind of got me down to that, and these methods that are being used now, right? I believe in Jim Jones and The Kool-Aid only works if everyone drinks it. Free Kool-Aid and vaccine boosters right this way. Follow me. It's the same stuff. I mean, it's just so obviously disgusting what they're trying to do. And here's Rosalind Carter. Thank you for your letter. I enjoyed being with you during the campaign and do hope you can meet Ruth Carter Stapleton soon. Comments about Cuba are helpful. Hope your suggestions can be acted on in the near future. So he was really, really tied in. Yeah. And then here's Mark Lane, and this is Dan White. He has a big story of his own, right? He was on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors with Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk. And then 5 days after Congressman Leo Ryan's funeral, he went in and shot and killed Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone, and Dianne Feinstein was the other person who was on the Board of Supervisors at the time, and she became the interim mayor at that point in time. And there is a lot of stuff going around that period. So I think there's probably another hour or two around the events and the aftermath. And I think this is probably a good time to like open it up for discussion or comments or feedback. And then we can kind of pick up the big fireball disaster of the ending in our next discussion. Is that good for you guys? That makes sense? All right.
Yep. I was just thinking about some of these assassin guys' characters. I remember reading somewhere that a lot of these guys had a copy of The Catcher in the Rye with them when they made these assassins, or they had them in possession. That's always stuck with me. I've never read it. That's an interesting thing. And it seems like, this mind control stuff, whatever is in these, classic books or The Catcher in the Rye. I remember another book, Transformation, Kathy O'Brien, and she was talking a little bit about the MKUltra stuff, and they were using a lot of the old Wizard of Oz lines and stuff and things to trigger thoughts and actions or whatever.
Yeah.
And I remember that book, and I remember her talking about, she was alive she was a young being trafficked during a lot of this time. And I remember her talking about going down to Mexico, Cuba. And I'm like, man, she was probably in the middle of all this stuff too. And I'm curious to go look at that and see what was in there. But there's a lot going on here.
I think one thing to kind of keep in mind is that, in my opinion anyway, with the assassination of Kennedy, basically that was the CIA's coup of the White House, in my opinion, and they have just been working steadily from that day to this, just using that position to take control of everything else.
Absolutely.
And it ties back into that book or the article at length that somebody posted in about the beginning of the Nazis, or anyway, maybe it was you, Tim. I'm not real clear on it, but anyway, it's just the same stinking people, right? But anyway, I don't mean to discount it, but it's just, that's, the CIA is in everything, It's just,
they are, wow. Yeah. So what Josh was saying, like Mark David Chapman he killed John Lennon, and he was, I think, the guy who had The Catcher in the Rye in his pocket. But he was like a Sirhan type guy. I think he just fired the gun wildly. And May contends that John Lennon, who actually funded The Realist, which he published in Clandestine Line, clandestinely. Like they didn't want people to know that he didn't want people to know that he was funding this magazine called The Realist, and May published into that magazine. And I think she met John Lennon too. But she says that he was a Sirhan character and he was mind controlled. And the real killer was Jose Sanejas Perdomo, who was the doorman who was involved in Operation 40 and was an anti-Castro Cuban. So he did the real deed, much like Thane Eugene Caesar did the real deed on RFK, shooting him in the back of the head when Sirhan was firing wildly. And this, something that blows my mind a little bit is that Mark David Chapman was a World Vision employee, and he worked at Haitian refugee camps, or he worked with Haitian refugees in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. Sorry, and he, then he went on to World Vision works with refugees worldwide, and then he went on to kill John Lennon. But Darby, what I'm thinking is that this incorporation of the Galen org after World War II and the melding of that with the Dulles OSS and Bill Donovan org, the Galen org being the Nazi intelligence East for the Soviet Union, that they just brought all those methods and techniques that they had learned in the concentration camps for mind control and torture, as well as all the rocket scientists like Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger, who worked at Bell Helicopter, into the United States, and they just spun that program up domestically.
Well, I often say that the Nazis won World War II, but the Germans lost,
Yeah. It does appear that way in a lot of circumstances.
Well, this is a great find, Tim. Thank you for doing this. This is very, very interesting, and I'm learning things that I didn't know.
Me too. Thank you, Darby. It's just amazing to pull a couple threads. And if you get a chance to listen to any of May's broadcasts, I mean, it's just amazing what she comes up with. So I'm just trying to pull the next layer below what she says in 1 hour. And she has like a 40-foot container of all of her research is out there somewhere. And they were looking for funding to try to house that thing. And I don't know where it is now or what's going on with that. Yeah. But they were trying to suppress her work at the time. And I imagine that they would continue.
Think they got her. I think they got her.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. I mean, she and Jack Ruby and lots of people.
Well, she was a whole FBI all by herself. I mean, they'd throw out a crime and she'd solve it.
Well, the problem is she touched the third rail, which was the Presidio child daycare scandal. It's much like the Franklin scandal. Like, you can't touch that thing. Those guys went down in flames. Yep.
Well, yeah, you go near that, then you're literally walking into the mouth of the beast. So that's the no man's land. That's the big taboo.
That's a comet ping pong of its day.
It's and a lot of people have died since then too, since the whole comet ping pong thing.
Yes, they get Arkancided. They get Clinton's depression syndrome. It's characterized by improbable suicides.
Yeah.
What do you think, Michael? What are you going to throw on me?
I was just going to say the location of Jonestown is rather unique because rivers that basically all the exits. There's only one little spot where you can try and get out of there without crossing a big river, and I'm sure that's probably some pretty precarious terrain. So I would think that as far as the location of a place that people can get out of, that's pretty much the epitome of that place. And so being surrounded by jungle, I mean, essentially they put people in there and they ain't going to get out.
No, nobody's getting in either.
And so I would think that that's that's kind of one of those things where a lot of the like if it's a black site, if you put people in there, they escape.
Yeah, it's an excellent black site. Yep. And you can imagine that these black sites that the CIA has where they do their extraordinary rendition now were much like that back in the day. This is probably one of those sites initially.
So I'm thinking, probably people that were MKUltra during the 50s and 60s, or, and a lot of other experiments that were going on, probably in, even into the 70s, were probably, just put out there so that they needed to, get rid of them for whatever reasons, like you were saying earlier, the idea of experimenting with human subjects. Well, there goes your evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh. Amos, what do you think?
Well, hey, by the way, great research, Tim. You really done a lot of homework. Excellent. One thing I read was that was the Jonestown was a Union Carbide plant or whatever. One time it was it was theirs. They had a whatever. I don't know if they had a factory there or whatever. Somebody was saying, I was reading something about them having a lot of resources there, and possibly that they were putting people in there to do slave labor for I don't know how realistic that is, but anyway, I guess it was a Union Carbide plant at one time. But it's also interesting. I mean, the overlay and with like Manson and the whole San Francisco scene at that time, Jolly West and, all the experiments with drugs and stuff like that there. And then, he's there at that time developing his scene with the MKUltra backing, for sure. All those same characters, the San Francisco Project and all that was going on at the same time. So, and not to mention, having law enforcement, that they're pulling the strings, the CIA is pulling the strings because just like Manson, they can't touch this guy. It doesn't matter what they do. I mean, he was at one point he became golden in the San Francisco area, but he was sort of, always right on the edge, but, they let him go. They wouldn't, all that. So it's interesting to see that going on too, at the same time, in the same place. In a lot of respects. So yeah, great job, man.
Yeah, and that's the thing that May does is, right, she synthesizes all these events into a big point of view and drops all the evidence back onto us, reading and synthesizing 8 papers a day and multiple magazines and books. And I think, in doing the work, then the connections begin to come faster and faster, and the picture grows bigger and bigger, and it's a little bit addictive to be in that rabbit hole and start seeing those connections, putting them together. So I really appreciate you all participating and coming to the discussion and facilitating my obsession. So I appreciate that.
Thanks for doing it, Tim.
All right. So I think next week we'll try to deep dive a little bit of down at the site and then the aftermath, and then we'll pick another subject after that. Does that sound good? All right.
If you can get through it all, man,
we'll see if I can get through it all next week.
Yeah.
All right.
Mean, the Nazi connection and what's going on today in the medical industrial complex.
Oh my goodness. We're not there
yet. Man, that's deep, man. It just has been growing since the 40s. So, all right. Thanks a lot, Tim.
All right, guys. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Bye.